In the last episode of our NC Miata track build series, we discovered that there was oil on the spark plugs, and this was a likely sign that the valve cover gasket had failed, and as a result, today we're going to be replacing it. So I'm going to be showing the entire process to change a valve cover gasket on an NC Miata, and this is a pretty similar process for really any vehicle in general, so let's get started. So here we go, replacing the valve cover gasket on this NC Miata. The first thing I want to talk about is diagnosis. The biggest giveaway is going to be oil spraying out of the sides of your valve cover. You'll see this kind of black soot that sits all over the block, as you see here. And the other thing that you're going to want to look for is if you have oil on your spark plugs. That's actually what notified me of it. If you look at my previous build series episode, I had oil on my spark plugs, and that's because the gasket is supposed to keep oil out of the spark plug wells, and because it failed, it was getting down in there. So the first thing you're going to want to do is remove these braces on top because it's going to make it easier to get to the back of the engine. Then unplug the sensor on the front side of the engine and start removing each of your 4 coil packs. So they're held in with a 10mm screw, and there's just one screw that holds each coil pack on, so we're going to want to undo all 4 of those and then pull the coil pack out. There's an injector plug on the back side of it that has to get undone right here, and then once both of those are undone, you can put the coil pack back and out of the way, and this is going to give us access to the actual valve cover. Repeat this on all 4 cylinders. Then we're going to disconnect this vent hose right here that sits on the front. Just a flathead screwdriver will get rid of it. Move it out of the way, remove this little black holder in the front, and then on the side we're going to start working on some of these AC lines. So this one right here just has a 10mm nut on it that I broke loose and am actually going to be pulling out of the way. This is going to help us access some of the screws on this back side of the valve cover. There are 14 screws that hold the valve cover of the NC Miata on in total, and some of these that are sitting more in the back of the car are pretty hard to reach, and this is going to make our lives a lot easier. Then there's these 2 sensors on the middle of the valve cover in the very back that you have to disconnect each of by hand. Just pull the plugs out and then unscrew the actual sensors. So then I went ahead and wiped down the engine. This is going to free us of any dirt or grime that could be on the engine, because once we go ahead and open it up, I don't want any of that dirt getting down into the actual engine, as that could be very harmful to your internal components and result in rapidly increased wear. I then took a toothbrush to each of the 14 bolts that hold the valve cover gasket, or the valve cover on, and you can see there's a lot of dirt that came off of here. Now we are pretty much ready to start taking it off. You have to remove the dipstick, and then we start with the front bolts, and I worked my way to the back, just loosening all of them to a point where the valve cover is able to come off. And interestingly, you don't actually have to remove the bolt all the way. Once it gets loose, it's fine there. You can take it out all the way, but there's a second set of threads that are meant to hold it in place while you are working on the valve cover. With all of them off, just a rubber mallet knock to the side of the valve cover will knock it loose, and then you can go ahead and pull it off, and now we have access to the inside of our valve train. So the first thing that I did here was wipe off the entirety of where that gasket was sitting. We're going to want to remove any of that old dirt, any of that old gasket that is sitting there and worn out, because it's going to affect the seal that we get with the new one if you leave it behind. So just a simple cloth can remove all of this, go around the whole thing, and be very thorough to remove it all. Here's the actual valve cover, and this is the true gasket change that we're doing here. I recommend a small pick or something like that. You can see the one that I have in my hand. You just pry out a small section of the gasket, and then once that's up and free, you can remove the entirety of the gasket by just simply reaching around and pulling the entire thing out. It doesn't require you to be super careful or anything like that, but there are 4 gaskets in total. There's the outer one that you just saw me remove. Then there's one on cylinders 1 and cylinders 4, each have their own, and then there's a shared gasket on cylinders 2 and 3 in the middle. So you're going to go ahead and remove all of these, and then we'll be ready to put the new one on. So with all of the old gaskets out, I also wanted to go ahead and wipe out the inside of the valve cover, just in case I got any dirt or debris in there. It would be a good chance to make sure it's clean before we go ahead and put things back together. Here is the replacement valve cover gasket. I got it at AutoZone for around $30. You just go there and ask them for a valve cover gasket that fits the NC Miata, and they'll set you up with one of these right here. All you have to do is go ahead and realign them in the positions that they fit. It's pretty obvious the orientation of each of them because they have unique shapes that only really fit in one direction. The outer one is a little bit hard, so check both orientations and there will be one that makes distinctly more sense. With all of these in, you just simply push each of them down, and we're now ready to treat the engine side. You have to get some gasket maker here and put a little bit of it on each side of the engine. Where the timing chain cover meets the block, there are two seams that sit on either side that'll have some old gasket maker on it. You're gonna have to wipe that off first with a flathead screwdriver, razor blade, any of the above. You just want to remove as much of that as possible for this new gasket to have a nice seal. You then take this gasket maker and just dab it lightly on each seam. You don't have to overdo it, but just enough to keep that seam sealed and help this new valve cover gasket get a proper seal all the way around so that you don't have any issues with it in the future. The last thing that I did was I took some of this gasket maker and actually put it around this middle thing here. And the reason I did that is because this also has to get sealed, and there's an O-ring that seals it that I didn't replace. So I figured for good measure, in case this had any kind of leakage in it as well, if I put some gasket maker on there, it would go ahead and solve that problem. With all of those done, you can go ahead and put the valve cover back on. I recommend trying to fit the back of it in first. To me, that's the harder side to get in, so if you do that first, the front will kind of just snap on right down. And now we're ready to start reassembling everything in the orientation that we had it. And what's critical here to know is that of the 14 bolts, there's no particular order to put them in, but you generally want to work in to out to help the gasket seal and so that it doesn't get squished or moved in any strange orientation. And as a result, I recommend doing the 2 bolts in the middle first, and this applies to any valve cover gasket, and then slowly working your way out to the outer edges as you go around. So I did these 2 middle ones and then the outer bolts that are in the middle, and then I worked towards each end of the valve cover. With all of that done, we're ready to start putting things back together. Here I am installing the rear bracket back onto the valve cover and putting the sensors back together as well. Some of these bolts were easier to do by hand, as it can be hard to fit actual tools in there at times, and eventually you're gonna have to, but it's easier to get it started without one. But once you go to tighten it down, you do have to actually torque these bolts down to spec. I believe it was 89 inch-pounds, but you're gonna want to double check that for your particular year and your particular car. From then on, it's pretty much just a case of reinstalling everything that we took apart in the reverse order, and then we'll have a new valve cover gasket. And with that, we have a new valve cover gasket on our NC Miata. This is a problem that we definitely did not want to let propagate further down the road, and something that should certainly be fixed before you do any kind of track use or hard performance driving. So it was a nice cheap fix. It took me maybe 2 to 3 hours, and is definitely worth doing yourself opposed to taking to a dealership or a shop, as it's going to be much more expensive from the labor hours there. So that's going to be just about it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with the rest of this NC Miata track build series, as we're actually going to be testing the car on track within the next few weeks here, and I'm really looking forward to having the entire thing finished. So thank you for watching and have a great day.